England is a nation which has had a significant impact on, and in fact has played a significant role in shaping human civilization for hundreds of years. And today, in this video, we're going to take a look at that history and explore just what England is, who its people are, and how it became the world-changing nation that it is today. So to start, you have to know exactly what England is, and I'm guessing if you've clicked on this video, you've probably heard of England before, and that's great. But a lot of people don't know the difference between England and Britain, or England and the United Kingdom, and things like that. So, really quickly here, here's the island that we call Great Britain. The term great isn't about ego, it's about geography. Here is England. It's important to understand Scotland here and Wales here are also British. This whole thing is Britain. So while all English are British, not all British are English. The confusion typically comes from the fact that today these three countries are all united into one single country, the United Kingdom, which also includes Northern Ireland and used to include the rest of Ireland for reasons that we'll get into today. But because England is the seat of the Union, the seat of the kingdom, the term British is often mistakenly only applied to England. So with that out of the way, let's focus on that part of the island which we call England, and let's go back a little over 2,000 years. At this time, England was inhabited by various Celtic tribes, not Celtic, Celtic. Compared to the Mediterranean nations of Europe around at the time, such as the Romans, the people here were primitive, though not as primitive as you would imagine. The Celtic tribal societies of early England were fairly complex agricultural societies. They were in contact with the European mainland, and on the bright side of this, trade made its way to and from pre-Roman England, but on the dark side, they were at times invaded by tribes from the European mainland. Though they all spoke a similar language and followed a similar religion, which was a predecessor of modern Celtic languages such as Welsh, for example, they were not united societally as a people. Accordingly, of course, they waged war with each other. During those wars, they would build defensive structures, much like the one shown here, called Maiden Castle, dating back long before the Romans even arrived on the island. The religion practiced here was similar to much of northwestern Europe at the time. In fact, the Romans noted that the religion that they practiced in England was very similar to the one which they practiced in Gaul, also known as modern France. It was a pagan religion, but what's very interesting about it to most people is the Druidism that was practiced here, and the rest of Britain and Ireland as well, as the Druids were unique to the British Isles. The Druids were a very interesting group of people. They were religious authorities, of course, but they weren't just priests. They were also politically involved. They were doctors, they were judges, they were historians, they were advisors, things like that. They were very much a group of elite in Iron Age England, and their opinion had considerable impact on the early societies here. Much of what we know about the societies of this time comes to us from the Romans and their records of the island. And we see evidence of the impact that the Druids had on their society when the Romans do come to the island that they call Britannia. Now, it's fair to have mixed opinions on the religion that was practiced here and throughout the rest of the British Isles, called simply Celtic paganism. There was some human sacrifice involved, which is to most of us today pretty abhorrent. The Romans back then didn't like it either. They were appalled by it. They discussed how horrendous it was that the Celts would do such a thing during their gladiator fights. And we've actually found some evidence of this human sacrifice in the United Kingdom and Ireland. This is a picture of a decently preserved corpse of an individual who was a part of these practices from these times. I believe this individual is from Ireland. On the upside though, as I've explained before, the pagan Celtic beliefs stuck around in various ways to influence us today. The most notable example is perhaps Halloween, the Celtic night of Samhain, which was Christianized and then became modernized to the holiday that we know today. There was no writing in the society, and in fact the Druids, when confronted with writing, were fine without it. They claimed that writing things down was bad for your memory, so a lot of what we know about England at this time comes to us from archaeological finds, or as I said, the accounts of the Romans, and it is when the Romans invade Britain that we really get to understand the world here at the time. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar invaded Britain, and again in 54 BC, but he was unsuccessful both times, essentially gaining no territory. Part of the justification he had for invading the island was that the people of this region had assisted the Gauls against Rome due to their economic relationship with them. They were both Celts, they both related to each other, they traded and things like that. Remember also that I said that the British tribes were not isolated from the rest of Europe, like one might think they were. But the true age of Roman Britain comes about 90 years later in 43 AD, when 40,000 Roman soldiers set sail from the province of Gaul to invade the island. Now, there were a number of obvious benefits to be obtained from invading and capitulating Britannia, trade and resources and the expansion of the empire and all that, but a huge motivation here was that the emperor at the time wanted to improve his image. Emperor Claudius came to become emperor, and he was quite justifiably insecure. He was seen as kind of weak and even moronic by his peers and by the population. He thought that if he could go to Britain and conquer it and effectively do what Julius Caesar did not do, he would bolster his image quite significantly, and so he ordered the operation and put his brother-in-law in command of it. The Roman soldiers were admittedly frightened by this prospect. Before they left, records tell us that their morale was kind of low. Britain at this time was the edge of the unknown, so they were obviously very scared. They were concerned that the island harbored ferocious savages and demons and such things. Morale, though, did change, and the Romans set sail for Britain, landing in modern-day Kent. Unfortunately for the native Britons, though, when the Romans landed, they made a mistake. The Britons actually caught wind of the fear among the Romans and assumed that there would be a mutiny before the Romans could land, so one of the most powerful tribes on the island, the Cativolani, did not make a proper move to defend the shore. They simply assumed the invasion would dissolve before it arrived. But it did not, and the Romans landed and established a fort and even a triumphal arch eventually and such things. And then they pressed into the rest of the island. Now there was obviously a good deal of conflict as the Romans pressed into the rest of Britannia. There were at times a number of revolts amongst occupied tribes, but a significant amount of tribes, about 11 in fact, actually surrendered to the Romans during this time, before conflict even emerged. Why? Well, the Roman military machine, as historians often refer to it, was simply too powerful. The Romans were susceptible to guerrilla warfare, of course, but out on the open field, tribes like those in Britain at the time did not have much of a chance. To bolster this image of being a powerful and unstoppable invasion force, when Claudius actually comes to visit Britain, he enters on an elephant, a beast which the people of this region had obviously never seen before. They were astonished. Roman occupation sets in, and Britannia, modern-day England again, becomes a province, a defining moment in early English history. Not everyone is so satisfied with being occupied, however. Boudica, a woman of the Iceni tribe in particular, was not satisfied. Boudica was the wife of a very important tribal figure who maintained an alliance with the Romans. However, after her husband's death, the Romans turned on them. She was beaten and her 2 daughters were raped, an incident that she did not easily forget. Around 60 AD, Boudica gathered forces from multiple British tribes, primarily the Iceni and Trinovantes, as well as some others, and led a revolt against the Romans. The revolt was not a minor incident. Her forces would cause extreme chaos in the province as she killed thousands of inhabitants and burned down 3 cities, including Londinium, if that name sounds familiar to you. The situation was becoming so extreme that the emperor at the time, Nero, considered withdrawing from Britain entirely. However, Boudica was eventually defeated. She was never captured by the Romans, rather it was likely that she committed suicide to avoid capitulation. Following this incident, Britannia was firmly Roman. The Romans would hold on to this province until 410 AD. Now, talking about history so far back, that might not seem like such a long time, but keep in mind, that was 350 years. The United States today, for comparison, is only 241 years old, so it was a decent span of time. So after that fairly turbulent time period of conflict with the Picts to the north and other rebellions and disorder and such things, Rome starts to become weakened in its homeland. It simply can't afford to spare troops or supplies to defend distant provinces like Britannia. So when Rome starts to become weakened and the province starts to face threats from the Picts and the Germanic tribes threatening Britain, the Emperor Honorius basically tells them that they're on their own, which was shocking to the British people, and the Roman Empire just altogether fell 66 years later. Though the Romans had technically left Britain, it's important to consider what the Romans had left behind at this point. Roads, infrastructure, cities like London, Manchester, and York, and of course, Christianity, which will play a major role in English history. And following the fall of the Roman Empire, we begin to see a rise from this rubble, the beginnings of what will be eventually called England, but not quite yet. Following 410, it's not like as soon as the Roman military left that the British society suddenly reverted back to its pre-Roman state. It was, of course, still Roman Britain. The aristocracy still held its power, the structure was still Roman, the Britons were still Christians, Latin was still spoken, etc., etc. What had happened was that the Britons were just suddenly given self-rule, mostly against their wishes, but it was what they were stuck with. They pleaded multiple times for the Romans to come back following 410, but with no such thing happening, they set up their own military and defense, modeled, of course, off Rome's. So even though the Roman Empire is gone, these people are still identifying as Romans. Roman societal structure, as I said, is still in place, and that will continue even after the Roman Empire has fallen. Despite their efforts to defend themselves, they're not very successful. Picts from Scotland, Irish from Ireland, and other raiders tear apart the country. So the people of former Roman Britain come up with a very Roman solution to the issue. Hire mercenaries to deal with it, and that's what they do. They hire a group of very effective mercenaries that had already been fighting on the side of the Romans as mercenaries from northern Germany known as the Anglo-Saxons. 3 ships of these people are sent over to deal with the Picts, and deal with them they do indeed. The Picts they're badly defeated and driven back into modern-day Scotland. As tribute for their service, the Britons give the Saxons some land in modern-day Kent, which leads to many more Saxons coming over to settle the new land. Thousands of them, in fact. And it's not just warrior mercenaries coming over anymore, it's women and children, and that means they're staying. Adding on to this, it's entirely likely that the Anglo-Saxons and other North Germanic peoples had already been living on the island for a while before all these incidents. Unfortunately though, after the Picts are dealt with, the Britons discover that the Saxons aren't very good neighbors. They're pagans, they're considerably different, they don't see eye to eye on a number of things, and eventually the whole thing backfires on the Britons and the Saxons invade them. Conflict erupts and the British are led by a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-Briton considered to be one of the last Romans. And so the two sides go to war over what will become England. Eventually, after a sustained war, the two sides meet at the Battle of Mons Batacanus around the year 500, probably near the modern city of Bath. This is a very important battle. It's here that the Britons finally defeat the Saxons and secure their existence against total domination. Following this battle, the Saxons are left with the east of England, where they develop around 30 kingdoms. To the west, though, the Britons actually keep on living. Their land is named after the Saxon word for foreigner, Wales. It's during this conflict also that we begin to hear legends of King Arthur, and in fact it's said that a figure known as Arthur was responsible for the British victory at the Battle of Mons Batacanus, and also for the long period of peace with the Saxons which followed. How much of this legend is true? Well, what really happened in detail is pretty unclear. Obviously these major events and territorial changes and battles and such things really did happen, but it probably wasn't as much of a solidifying clean cut in the division between Britons and Saxons as tales tend to tell. In fact, probably a lot of Britons just assimilated into Saxon culture as they were invaded and more Saxons immigrated to the new land. King Arthur may have been real, he may represent an actual figure, again though the truth remains unfortunately unclear. But historians are emphasizing that following this conflict and such, it wasn't as much of a Saxon invasion as it was a Saxon migration. There's evidence, in fact, of Saxons and Britons living together in certain circumstances. And just eventually the Britons, who did not go to Wales, just kind of adapted to the dominant Saxon culture and language and traditions and things like that. The Angles and the Saxons were just two of the North Germanic peoples to settle England. They were also primarily joined by the Jutes, and some DNA evidence suggests that the Frisians from modern-day Holland joined them as well. These tribes followed very similar religions and very likely spoke very similar languages, and in fact they had little difficulty communicating with each other. Through time, these Germanic tribes would cease to think of themselves as different from each other and reach a point of integration, at which point they would simply prefer to call themselves the Anglo-Saxons, or in their Anglo-Saxon language, Anglican. Why not Saxish or Saxland, considering the great importance of the Saxon tribe? Well, again, the gradual integration made the distinction less important. Interesting to note though, even today in many Celtic languages, the name for England is still based off the Saxon people. Shoshana, for example, in modern Irish. The 400 or so years following the Roman Empire's fall is a period marked by very large migrations of people across Europe in general, and England continued to absorb immigrants from northern Germania. Anglo-Saxon England, through the 500s to the 800s AD, was ruled by scores of kingdoms in a very turbulent and admittedly confusing landscape. In fact, it's not just confusing to us today, there's reports of foreigners from the mainland being confused by it. The names of some kingdoms, in fact, are lost to history, but the major ones included ones such as Kent, Wessex, Sussex, Mercia, and Northumbria. Throughout the 7th century AD, the Anglo-Saxon people began to convert to Christianity. The remnants of this conversion last to this day. Though the Roman Empire had fallen to pagan invaders, the descendants of these pagans across Europe did in fact end up obviously converting to Christianity, and pressures from the mainland, Wales, and also Ireland, which had already been converted to Christianity, led to the Anglo-Saxons adopting the religion as well. And through Christianity, they connected themselves to the larger European picture in a critical time when post-Roman Europe was forming. Despite conflicts and lack of political unity among the early English, this was a time of economic stability and prosperity. It was a time period in which Anglo-Saxon language, religion, culture, society, and such things could begin to take root. Unfortunately, at the same time that the Anglo-Saxons were taking root in England, another force not far from their island was beginning to take flight. A force which, due to geography, the English would bear the full brunt of, and this force would permanently alter the course of English development. This force, developing in modern-day Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, we know today as the Vikings. To elaborate a little bit here, the word Viking more correctly refers not to the Norse people, but to the Norse raiders and explorers who wreaked havoc on Europe for over 250 years, a period known as the Viking Age. And England would be forever changed by it. And in fact, the Viking Age would begin in England, off the coast of Northumbria on an island known as Lindisfarne. Now, we've already talked about the Vikings on this channel before, so I won't go too into depth on their origins. If you're interested in that, I have videos on my channel already. I made the mistake of breaking them into like 5 separate videos, but it's the same content, essentially. So, these Vikings arrive out of Scandinavia to, as I said, the island of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was a small island home to an abbey of monks who were living there. It was not a well-defended area, and that was actually kind of intentional. As I've said, the politics in England at this time were very turbulent and unstable. You had kings and kingdoms being the victims of and the propagators of these plots and conflicts that seemed to continue without cessation. So churches essentially just kind of wanted to be in isolation, away from all that. Now, the attack on Lindisfarne, in which these Vikings just showed up and essentially slaughtered or enslaved all of these defenseless monks, was not the first Viking raid on the British Isles, not even really the first raid, technically, on England. But it was the first specifically recorded major incident. It's recorded in what are called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and that's why it marks the beginning of the Viking Age. For the next 60 years, England would be plagued by Viking raids. Now, it's not as if the English kings did nothing about this. Eventually, they did wise up and prepare defenses against the Vikings, which were effective. In fact, many Viking raiders just kind of gave up on England and started going to weaker Scotland and Ireland. But the lack of political unity in England prevented any united response against the Viking raids in the beginning. Now, I said 60 years. I don't mean to mislead you to think that after these 60 years that things got better. On the contrary, they got worse. The Vikings say, instead of raiding England, let's just go and take it over. And so in the year 865, a few Viking leaders actually assemble an army to go and do this. It's not clear how large the army was. It might have been about 1,000 warriors, it might have been over 1,000, it might have been even less than 1,000. So not a magnificently large army. Keep in mind there was no single Norse nation at the time to raise such an army. It was more like a coalition of a bunch of different Viking groups coming together out of a mutual interest who would, in all likelihood, not associate much after England had been conquered. It was a small army, but it was a considerably devastating one. So here's England at the time. As you can see, there are fewer kingdoms here than was the case in the 7th century. It's mostly dominated by this time by Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, with the Celts to the west and the north and some other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the east here. So the Vikings land in the territory of one of these smaller eastern Saxon kingdoms, East Anglia. The East Anglians didn't really put up much of a fight at first. They sort of just surrendered and let the Vikings pass through their land. In 866, they moved to attack Northumbria. They took the city of York, and the Northumbrians essentially surrendered too, and the Vikings put a puppet king on the Northumbrian throne. East Anglia later rejects this Viking domination and stands against them, but they're crushed, and their leader, King Edmund, was killed. So by now, as you can see, the Vikings have made very significant progress into England with actually very little conflict. Now they move to invade the kingdom of Mercia. The Mercians put up quite a fight, and they call on assistance from the kingdom of Wessex to do so. In the year 870, a Viking named Bagsig brings reinforcements called the Great Summer Army. With the Viking army now strengthened, they begin to pillage England and move toward the kingdom of Wessex. The king of Wessex at this time is a king named Ethelred, and he leads an army along with his younger brother Alfred, only 22 at the time, to take on the Vikings. They were at first not very successful, but eventually they met at what is remembered as the Battle of Ashdown. Ethelred and Alfred split their forces into two. The Vikings began to advance across the field, but Ethelred insisted on praying before advancing to meet them. Alfred, on the other hand, felt that there was no time for prayer, and he charged toward the Vikings with his half of the army. And with the help of his brother, who later did join him, he was victorious, and the Vikings retreated back to the land which they had conquered in England, referred to as the Danelaw, shown here. Ethelred actually dies that same year, and Alfred rises to become king. The Vikings, though defeated at this battle, were definitely not done, and they continued to threaten Mercia and Wessex. Alfred at first paid them off, but eventually in the year 878 he engaged them in battle again, where he was again victorious. It was now that the Vikings were kind of falling back. They withdrew from Mercia back to the Danelaw, and it was clear that England would remain. Accordingly, Alfred gets two very important titles placed to him in history. The first is the Great. He is only one of two monarchs in English history to be called the Great. The second is that he goes from being called King of the West Saxons, which is Wessex, to King of the Anglo-Saxons. This idea of Anglo-Saxon unity begins to take root here, and it continues on with his successors. In the year 910, Alfred's son took it to even greater limits. He conquered the Vikings shown here in East Anglia and the Vikings here in Mercia as well, and began moving northward, eventually capturing York. Now, as you can see, Edward had control of a considerable amount of modern England. He ruled over many of the formerly divided Anglo-Saxons, and this is where we begin to see the title King of England be truly accurately used. Edward's son, Ethelstan, continues the expansion of this kingdom, and his neighbors don't really like it. In fact, the Scottish and Irish kingdoms of the day get kind of concerned about this rising English power, and they unite with the Vikings temporarily and take on Ethelstan at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, which the English won, thus preventing their progress from being fractured. For the moment, anyway. In 978, the Vikings returned under the leadership of Harold Bluetooth, and the King of England, known promptly as Ethelred the Unready, was unfit to face. In order to even maintain England's existence, he was forced to pay tribute to them for 20 years, which greatly crippled the English economy. In the year 1001, Ethelred married the daughter of a Viking king, the King of Norway, but in 1002 he foolishly ordered the massacre of Norse settlers in his territory, who were politically more aligned with the rising nation of Denmark than just more the ambiguous term Norse, which led to another 10-year conflict with the Danish Vikings. Ethelred fled to Norway, where he subsequently died in 1014, the same year as Svein Folkbeard, the king of the Danish. Now, the throne of England was up in the air, and Canute, the son of Svein, defeated Ethelred's son Edmund and claimed the throne for himself, becoming King of England in 1016. Canute wasn't done there. 2 years later, he claimed the throne of Denmark, and in 1028 the throne of Norway as well, thus founding the North Sea Empire, also known as the Anglo-Scandinavian Empire. Though Canute subsequently became the second and only other king in English history to be known as the Great, his empire did not last past his death in 1035. In fact, it essentially was over with his last breath. Canute's sons did succeed him in England, and his line continued until 1042, when an Anglo-Saxon, Edward the Confessor, took the throne. Edward ruled until 1066, whereafter he died without an heir, which quite obviously was going to cause him problems. To solve this, Harold Godwinson, the richest man in England, an Anglo-Saxon to whom he likely did actually leave the throne, succeeded him. In fact, he hastily crowned himself the day of Edward's funeral. Regardless, though, Godwinson's reign was doomed from the start, and many people of the day believed it, especially as Halley's Comet had passed by England during this time, which was seen as an obvious omen. That same year, England was invaded by Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, who had the intention of restoring the North Sea Empire. The Viking forces met the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where they were brutally defeated, and Hardrada was killed by an arrow. The better of the two heralds had won. His death and the failure of the Vikings' conquest marks the end of the Viking Age. The Vikings did not have an insignificant impact on England, though. In fact, their influence affected English history permanently. They contributed significantly to the English language. They set up a number of settlements in the British Isles, including the city of Dublin, which would become the capital of Ireland. Their culture and general presence shaped Anglo-Saxon England into the nation that it would become, and they even laid the seeds for England's next invader, the Normans. It was not even a month after Harold Godwinson's victory over the Vikings that in 1066, William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, invaded England. In fact, it was only 3 days later. Part of the justification for this was that William actually had a claim to the English throne. He was related to Harold's predecessor, Edward, and William, and in fact much of Europe, believed that the throne ought to have gone to him. William was very confident in his ability to conquer England. Tales were later told that his mother had a dream of a great tree extending over Normandy in England the night that he was conceived. Now, here is Normandy. It's today a part of France, but it's important to remember. Normandy was culturally and linguistically and such very similar to France, but the Normans themselves, including William, or in French, Guillaume, were the descendants of Vikings who had carved out that territory about 150 years early and simply integrated themselves into French society. In fact, the name Normandy is related to Northmen, i.e. the Vikings. So, William invades England with around 10,000 or so men, and within a few weeks he meets Harold Godwinson, who commanded maybe around 8,000 men at the Battle of Hastings. Harold and William were extremely eager to meet each other. In fact, Reports tell that William actually put his armor on backwards at first to rush to meet him. The battle lasted for most of the day, and the Normans, outgunned, with having more archers and cavalry, and likely outnumbered the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were defeated at this battle. Godwinson was likely killed toward the end of it, and soon thereafter, hope of victory against the Normans was lost. William the Conqueror now ruled one of the most powerful and stable kingdoms in Europe of the day. Hastings went down as one of the most significant battles in English history. Major changes followed this battle. Never again would an Anglo-Saxon rule England. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, too, had largely been dispossessed and replaced with Norman aristocrats. Anglo-Saxon English was now the language of the peasantry. The ruling elite spoke Norman French, and would actually continue to for some time. But Norman French and English would not remain separate. They would merge. In fact, modern English has a heavier influence from Norman French than the Anglo-Saxon Old English, giving us a plethora of words. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles simply left the country and moved to Scandinavia or Scotland or Ireland, including some of Harold Godwinson's family, who moved to Ireland. The Normans moved in to capitulate the Anglo-Saxons by asserting their dominance. They built churches and castles, including London Tower. They documented the entire country, revealing to us great detail about the societal structure of England 1,000 years ago. They gradually eliminated slavery in England at the time, reporting perhaps 10% of the population was formerly enslaved. But rebellion brewed. In the north, William faced an Anglo-Saxon rebellion which was assisted by the Danish, which he brutally suppressed. The Normans would face other rebellions too, as well as an invasion from France, but their hold over England would remain firm. William died the 9th of September in the year 1087. His successors, when they weren't busy trying to hold on to their reign, would continue to rule England, and eventually moved into Scotland and invaded Wales and Ireland. William's successors were not quite as successful as he was, though. Civil war broke out over successions. The monarchy would become considerably unstable, and following 2 invasions from Scotland, England enters into a period called the Anarchy, wherein King Henry I's nephew, Stephen, and his daughter fought for control of the throne largely because Henry I's son had unfortunately died unexpectedly. This period, which lasted 17 years, is remembered for its savage violence and bloodshed. Henry's daughter had divorced the Holy Roman Emperor and had married Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou, which becomes a very important detail. In 1033 she has a son with the Count whom she named Henry. Henry was destined to succeed his father, but his mother, Matilda, had great hopes that he would one day become King of England as well. After a considerable amount of conflict, with both sides coming close to victory and the nobility switching sides accordingly each time, the Civil War eventually ends in 1152, with Stephen becoming king. His rule was uneasy, as if that wasn't obvious following almost 20 years of civil war, but his succession was also unclear. And furthermore, his reign included England losing lands to Scottish and Welsh invaders. Despite these troubles, Stephen reigned until his death in 1154, 2 years after the anarchy officially ends. By this time, Henry, Matilda's son, was now the ruler of Anjou and much of western France, and he had married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Unfortunately for Stephen, his son Eustace had died earlier in the year 1153, leaving him without a successor. He reached an agreement with Henry of Anjou. Henry would succeed him, and there would be peace in England regarding the succession. Henry was coronated on the 25th of October, becoming Henry II and founding the Plantagenet dynasty, which would rule over the Angevin Empire, encompassing lands which would stretch from northern England to the Pyrenees. So once again, England had more French-speaking rulers from France. In fact, Henry only ever spoke very poor English. French and Latin were all that the ruler of England of the day needed. Henry II was known for his great temper. He was power-hungry, ambitious, energetic, and impulsive. To his benefit, he used these traits to secure power from the barons back to the monarchy and allowed him to expand his empire into Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and Ireland. But to his degradation, he would cause much of his own family to turn on him and would have a number of shocking incidents, such as the death of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket and the king had been feuding for years, and following a transgression, it's recorded that the king said in front of his men something along the lines of, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who have let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" Henry's knights, overhearing these words, took them literally and assassinated Becket soon after, an event which would ruin Henry's image across Europe. Now obviously, Henry had no intention of actually killing the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he could not control his anger and his men mistook him. In 1189, Henry would be succeeded by his third son, Richard I. It would come to be said of Richard that he possessed a coeur de lion, or the heart of a lion, because of his great success in battle, most notably during the Third Crusade, where he fought against Salah ad-Din, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. but also, of course, in defending his father from rebellion in his youth, and also in the battlefields of France, defending his territories there. Despite being King of England, Richard would spend perhaps as little as 6 months of his reign actually in England. In fact, he didn't have a whole lot of interest in England itself. He preferred to see it as a territory which supported his much larger European empire. Richard would die in 1199 from an arrow wound which became infected while fighting in France. He was succeeded by his younger brother John, who was less of a popular ruler. In fact, he isn't remembered as a very good ruler at all in English history. He first rebelled against his father Henry while he was still king, and then later against his brother Richard while he was king, failing, of course, both times. John was deeply concerned about being the youngest son of the royal family, but when placed in positions of power, such as in Ireland, he displayed greed and power hungriness. Despite this, he still became king. It's during John's reign that the tale of Robin Hood is placed, a government so bad that a thief is actually praised. John committed quite a few mistakes during his reign. He fought multiple losing wars and in fact lost Normandy to France, and the Angevin Empire really began to collapse with John. Accordingly, John would place heavy taxes on the lower classes to pay for these wars and would seize land from the nobility and the church to augment his power. He would even go so far as to rape the daughters of his noble subjects and personally murder a contender to the throne while he had him imprisoned. The nobles decided that they can't just sit by and let this happen, and the church was pretty unhappy too. So eventually a band of these nobles, supported by the church, gathers an army and rebels against the king, and they march on London. And the Archbishop of Canterbury drafts a treaty or a new rule book that would settle the dispute, the Magna Carta, in English, the Great Charter. It contained 63 new laws which the king was obligated to follow with regard to the church and the treatment of his barons. Not with so much focus on the common people just yet, but it was a start towards limiting the power of the government. King John signed it on the 15th of June, 1215. Now, John was essentially forced to sign it. He had no intention of actually following through with it, and he really didn't. The Pope annulled it, and in fact civil war would eventually break out between John and the barons, and John would continue denying the legitimacy of it until his death in 1217. Even though the principles laid out by the Magna Carta had a rough start, it remains a significant document as being the first time in English history that certain ideals were proposed. It puts forth the idea of rule of law, that the decisions of a nation should be made with great focus on the benefit of the nation, not as much the ruling elite. It proposes that the king may be above the laws of men, but not the laws of God. The king cannot be murderous and tyrannical without being reprimanded. It created a system where many of the king's decisions had to be cross-checked with the nobles of England, a system which would lead to the modern parliament. Quite obviously, many of these principles are central to England to this day. John's son, Henry III, would also fight over the legitimacy of the Magna Carta and would actually call together the first equivalent of a parliament. Henry would be succeeded by his son, Edward I Longshanks, or Longlegs, as he was a considerably tall and intimidating individual, in 1272. This is the king from the famous movie Braveheart, and I won't go incredibly into detail about that in this video because I've already done a video on the true story of that already. But Edward did indeed invade Scotland during his reign, earning him the nickname the Hammer of the Scots, but he did more than that too. As prince, he took part in the Ninth Crusade and would fight in the conflicts surrounding the Magna Carta and such at the time. On his coronation at Westminster Abbey, which was built by his father, Edward was crowned, and he declared that he would only adorn the crown once again when all the lands lost by his father were his. He was intent on dominating the British Isles. As king, he put down rebellions in Wales, reformed English law, and reaffirmed the power of the monarchy while at the same time setting up Parliament's permanence. Parliament gave him a route to tax his subjects to provide funding for his various wars on and off the British Isles, but problems regarding the power of the monarchy with great regard to this would continue even after his rule. He ordered the expulsion of the Jews from the country, a ban which lasted until the 17th century. Edward would have a very prolonged and costly war in Scotland, dealing with figures such as William Wallace, but a number of other Scottish nobles and leaders as well, even though prior to this period, Scotland and England lived in relative peace. During this war, though, Edward procured the Stone of Scone, the stone on which all Scottish kings had thus far been coronated, and he took it to England, who owns it to this day, though it is now kept in Scotland. Though he maintained his kingdom with a strong hand, his weaker son, Edward II, lacked his strength. His son, Edward, who was only one of the 15 children that he had, would ultimately lose the lands that his father had won in Scotland to Robert the Bruce, and would be a generally weak leader. He was a very obvious homosexual, which angered the barons of this day and likely contributed to his great difficulties with his wife, who would betray him with Roger Mortimer of Wales. He neglected his kingly duties. He had the unfortunate coincidence of being a king during bad weather, i.e. a 2-year famine which killed off 10% of England's population, and he was just eventually deposed in 1327. Mortimer and his wife Isabella ruled until Edward II's son, Edward, killed Mortimer and imprisoned his mother, becoming Edward III. Edward III's early reign consisted of war with Scotland, in which he had a decent amount of success, but eventually agreed to a truce with the Scottish. Part of the reason for the war which Edward III found himself in with the Scottish was a looming threat which England was right in the middle of, an alliance between Scotland and France, perhaps medieval England's two greatest enemies. With fears of a full-on invasion of England from France, and with France interfering with English trade and with the rest of the continent, Edward knew that he would have to take action against France, and he'd have to do it soon. To counter the Franco-Scottish alliance, known as the Auld Alliance, Edward would ally himself with other European nations, notably with Portugal. The alliance with Portugal, and as a matter of fact, would endure as one of the longest-lasting alliances in world history. That's not all, though. As the King of France, Philippe VI took the Duchy of Aquitaine, Edward would not solely just resist this invasion on his former territory, he would be so bold as to claim the throne of France for himself. Edward was in fact related to the French monarchy. Philippe VI was his uncle, but he did not have that much of a legitimate claim to the French throne. Edward was technically the closest living relative to Charles IV, the last king from the House of Capet, but Charles's instructions were for the nobility to choose the next king of France, and they chose Philippe VI, marking the beginning of the House of Valois in France, notably. Edward's actions were very obviously a response more to the political situation of the day, but Edward would still, regardless, press his rights as king, and would indeed invade France, even changing his royal standard to include both the Lions of England and the Fleur-de-Lis of France, as shown here. The war for the throne of France would not be an insignificant one. In fact, it would last for over 100 years, and thus historians have creatively named it the 100 Years' War. Two important points regarding the name 100 Years' War, though. The first is that it wasn't 100 years exactly, it was 116 years. The second, it wasn't just one long, endless war. It was more like 4 wars with a series of side wars, I suppose you could say, involved in this 116-year dispute. The 4 main wars were the Edwardian War, 1337 to 1360, the Caroline War, 1369 to 1389, the Lancastrian War, 1415 to 1420, and the Second Lancastrian War, 1420 to 1453. In 1340, Edward and his son Edward, who would be known as the Black Prince, invade France to not only defend the English possessions that England had in France, but of course to claim the crown of France. With England busy in France, Scotland moved in and retook much of their former territory, but their success in war against England during this war would not last forever. The English and the French met at the Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346. The Battle of Crécy was a disaster for the French forces. The English would lose perhaps around 200 men, the French would lose perhaps 6,000. Obviously, with this defeat, the French king was outraged, but how did this catastrophic defeat happen? Edward was fighting war differently. For much of European warfare leading up to this battle for hundreds of years, the horseman was the master of the battlefield. Against archer and infantrymen, they were difficult to defeat. Edward prepared for this, though. He had his men dig holes in the ground which would cause the horses to trip, he would put up stakes to deter or kill enemy horsemen, and crucially, he employed the English longbow. The English longbow, which was likely first invented in Wales, had a greater strength, range, and speed than the crossbows which the French and their Genoese mercenaries were using. They were, in truth, a deciding factor of this battle, leading to a brutal French defeat, even though they outnumbered English forces. Edward was also not fighting a stereotypical war either. Rather than having a series of battles, as had been in the case in warfare leading up to this point again, he preferred to simply skirmish the French relentlessly. Not long after this battle, the Black Death ravaged much of Europe, including England and France. The Yersinia pestis bacteria traveling across Europe from Central Asia through hitching a ride on pest would kill a victim within a matter of days. It began in 1348 and lasted until 1349, but it claimed the lives of 6 million English alone, half of the population at the time. France too lost perhaps half of its population. It would return in the 1360s, again killing millions. Regardless of these circumstances, though, the war would continue. Philippe VI died in 1350 and was succeeded by his son Jean II. On September 19, 1356, the English and French would meet at the Battle of Poitiers, where again the French would suffer a devastating defeat. Not only would they lose thousands to again minimal English losses, but their king was captured and was later ransomed. In 1360, the English and French signed the Treaty of Bretigny, which heavily favored the English, allowing them to keep all the land which they had won. And on the French side, well, at least it ended the conflict. This peace would only last 9 years though, and the 100 Years' War would start once again, and even during this peace, conflict in Brittany, which involved both England and France, would be occurring. I mentioned some new developments in how this war was being fought that were very innovative and revolutionary for the time, but longbows were not the only innovation. Artillery had a significant role in this war, and gunpowder was making its debut, albeit awkwardly. Beyond that, though, societies were changing. Even though this was a war concerning the power of monarchs and nobility, nationalistic tendencies were evolving in France and England. People felt a sense of duty not only to their king, but also to their nation. This attitude was quite certainly influenced by the introduction of standing armies. Prior to this, armies would be raised by the king and noblemen temporarily for wars, but because of the longevity of this conflict, the English and French felt it necessary to have a more permanent and disciplined fighting force, and the monarchs of these nations revised things like their taxation methods to support this. In 1369, the war was back on, propagated by the French this time under Charles V, hence it became known as the Caroline War. The Pope pleaded with the combatants to find peace, but the Church was preoccupied and was unable to truly convince the two to cease hostilities. Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince, would die in 1376, and Edward III in 1377. Edward III would therefore be succeeded by his grandson, who became Richard II in 1377. Richard was only 10 years old at the time, however, and therefore regency under John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, was instated. In 1381, following the stresses of the Black Death and the stresses of the taxes used to pay for the war, the English peasantry revolted, led by Wat Tyler of Kent. The revolt itself was not very successful and was over within half a year, but it showed the socio-economic strain on England during this age. 3 years later, in 1384, war with Scotland began again, and the king was forced to raise taxes, making King Richard even more unpopular. Meanwhile, the French carved back into many of their territories which had been lost in the first phase of the 100 Years' War, bringing the English to accept a truce in 1389. The French had won the second phase of the war, and peace would continue until 1415. Richard II was dethroned in 1399 and replaced with John of Gaunt's son, Henry IV. Henry IV was interestingly the first king since Harold Godwinson, whose mother tongue was English, not French, and very significantly, he was the first king of the Lancastrian branch of the House of Plantagenet. He would rule until 1413, when he was succeeded by his son, Henry V, who would play a major role in the 100 Years' War. He too would assert his claim over the French throne, and after making an alliance with the Burgundians, in 1415 Henry would invade Normandy, and very unfortunately for the French, their king, Charles VI, was insane. He was essentially unable to rule, and this caused a great divide between the French nobility about his succession, leading to a bit of civil war in this very crucial time. On October the 25th of that same year, the Battle of Agincourt took place, and this was the third great French military disaster. English tactics and technology succeeded again, and the English lost perhaps 600 men, while the French lost very likely over 8,000. Henry presses into France and, in fact, finally, in a sense, secures the French throne. Henry is declared to be, following the Treaty of Troyes, the heir of Charles VI, the King of France. To secure this further, he marries the king's daughter, Catherine. But then something unexpected happens. Henry dies young from dysentery in 1422, only 2 months before Charles VI dies. Now Henry's heir was his son, also named Henry, but the French did not recognize young Henry as the heir. They instead named their king's son Charles, who would be Charles VII king. And so, of course, war continues. It would have been very interesting to have seen what would have happened if Henry V had not died young and would have gone on to become King of France, but of course that's not what happened. With war back on though, a new hero, or rather heroine, would rise to the scene, this time on the side of the French. A young girl from the lower classes named Jeanne d'Arc, or in English, Joan of Arc. Joan had claimed to have had a vision from saints telling her that it was her duty to drive out the English from France, and she tried to tell the King of France this. The king was not interested at first until she made an accurate prediction regarding an upcoming battle. After this, the king decided to listen, and she claimed that she had to lead the French army to relieve the city of Orleans from siege. She did so, and she was victorious and was subsequently made a commander of the French forces. Now, in this time period, the French would have been reluctant to accept a farm girl as a commander, but France was running out of options at this point, and she seemed to be succeeding. Not long into the war, when she was only 19 though, the Burgundians captured her and sold her to the English, and the English found her guilty of heresy and burned her at the stake. The English had finally captured Joan of Arc, but her effect was irreversible, and the French were now winning the war. The war technically ends in 1453 at the Battle of Castillon, where England lost all land in modern France except for Calais, and France secured its victory, even though officially speaking the two nations would remain at war with each other for 20 more years or so, and England would continue to claim the crown of France for many years to come. Following this war, England would begin to enter the early modern era. The social, technological, and governmental and such aspects of English society have been changing and would continue to change following the 100 Years' War. But another conflict had been brewing throughout the 100 Years' War, however, an internal conflict in England, one which would surface following the end of the war and the end of the reign of Henry VI, who was considered a poor king, and exacerbated by his wife, Margaret of Anjou, the Wars of the Roses, as it came to be called. The Wars of the Roses were a series of civil conflicts fought for the control of the throne between the two houses of the Plantagenet dynasty, the Lancastrians, represented by a red rose, and the Yorkists, represented by a white rose. The conflict was not so cut and dry as it's often portrayed in tales of the time, especially those from Shakespeare, and even though it lasted for 30 years, it wasn't a brutal, agonizing war on the part of the English people. In the year 1485, the conflict comes to an end as Henry VII slays Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, a battle which only claimed the lives of 2,000 or so men but marked the end of the English Middle Ages for good. Henry VII, a Lancastrian with questionable heritage, thus merges the two houses of York and Lancaster into the House of Tudor by marrying the daughter of Henry IV, Elizabeth, which he represents with a white and red rose as shown here, and England moves on into a new age. Though now the ruler of Renaissance England, Henry VII still had to clean up from the Middle Ages. The Wars of the Roses had fractured England's government, and he struggled to hold on to his crown. Quite wisely, Henry pursued a peaceful foreign policy, trying to improve ties with both Scotland and France. Henry VII died on April 21, 1509. He was succeeded by his 17-year-old son, who became Henry VIII, thereby securing the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. Henry would be a very busy king, though in the eyes of many of the day, not the best one. His older brother Arthur had died 7 years prior, leaving the kingly duties to him. In fact, Henry would simply marry his widow, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. Catherine would bear him 2 sons, but both would be stillborns. The inability to produce an heir would trouble Henry, very much concerned with securing his succession, and would not only trouble Henry, but would cause a good amount of trouble for England in years to come. In the meantime, Henry would engage in conflict with the French, largely for personal glory, as these wars achieved relatively little. At the same time, Scotland would invade England, which would be another relatively pointless war, for which Henry would take the credit in winning, even though Catherine had managed the matter while Henry was in France. Catherine was still failing to produce a male heir, though she had produced a daughter, Mary. Mary would be the only one of 7 of Catherine's children who would live to adulthood. This deeply concerned Henry. A female heir in itself was a concern for a 16th century nation, let alone one for a nation which had just come out of the Wars of the Roses. Henry was determined to have a male heir, so determined, in fact, that he would make an incredibly bold move. He was essentially left with 3 options. He could legitimize one of his illegitimate sons, which would have been problematic. He could have attempted to have a grandson to inherit the throne, which would have also been problematic, or he could divorce his wife and marry a new one. He chose the third option in 1527, but the Pope did not approve. So how does Henry respond? He leaves the church altogether and starts his own church. Now, while the English Reformation, as it's called, was incredibly audacious, it did occur at the same time as the much larger Protestant Reformation, though the English Reformation was quite obviously less about religion and more about politics. Henry was very serious about this, ordering the rest of England to convert to his religion and in fact executing many who actively resisted. This schism would change English history permanently, throwing them into religious disagreement between Europeans for centuries. Henry would then marry Anne Boleyn, who would give birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and also, very unfortunately, a stillborn son. How does Henry respond to this? Not very maturely. He was convinced that he was cursed, and he accused Anne Boleyn of witchcraft and had her executed. He would then marry Jane Seymour, who would finally give him a son, Edward. Unfortunately, though, Jane Seymour would die from postpartum complications soon after. Henry would marry 3 more times after her death, producing only Mary, Elizabeth, and his son Edward, who would succeed him as Edward VI in 1547. In cruel irony, though, Edward would die before the age of 16 from tuberculosis, leaving only Mary and Elizabeth to inherit the throne. Mary, after doing away with Lady Jane Grey, became queen in 1553. There was an interesting twist to this though. Mary was a Catholic and was quite adamant about returning England to Catholicism. So after the English had been bullied and faced death for resisting Anglicanism, now Mary turned it around and bullied and executed Anglicans who refused to convert back to Catholicism. This was not the time to be openly pious, and Mary burned nearly 300 Protestants alive. As a result, she was given the nickname Bloody Mary. Mary died in 1558, and the English did not miss her. Despite attempts to secure a Catholic on the throne, including Philip, her husband, the King of Spain, she would be succeeded by her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth would rule for nearly 50 years, ushering in a golden age in English history known as the Elizabethan era. One of Elizabeth's first acts was, of course, to return England to Protestantism. This led to the Pope declaring her illegitimate and a heretic, yet Elizabeth quite wisely was not as aggressive concerning Protestantism as her predecessors had been. She was more tolerant of Catholics, and accordingly she maintained a decent amount of peace in England between the different religious groups of the day. Elizabeth never married and had no children, earning her the title the Virgin Queen. Later on, the English would name a North American colony after her, Virginia. Why she chose to never marry is unknown. She claimed that her husband was England and her children were the English people, although it's very likely linked to the political instability that a marriage might have caused, especially for a queen. But she did, in fact, have many suitors, and she fell in love with a man named Robert Dudley. Under Elizabeth's reign, English Renaissance culture would flourish, the most notable figure of this time being William Shakespeare, considered perhaps one of the greatest writers in human history. Just because Elizabeth was more tolerant towards English Catholics does not mean that foreign Catholic nations were tolerant towards her, and she would be forced to deal with the plots and conflicts of other major Catholic powers of the day, such as France and Spain. One of her first moves regarding this political and religious situation was to spread Protestantism in Scotland, thereby attempting to break the Franco-Scottish alliance, knowing that France could use Scotland as an ally in a potential war, as it had done many times throughout history. Part of the reason for this threat came from Mary, the Queen of the Scots, who had also been the Queen of France for only a year, and furthermore, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England. Catholic Europe recognized Mary, a Catholic, as the rightful ruler of England, and she married Henry Stuart, an English Catholic with a claim to the English throne as well. Quite naturally, this concerned Elizabeth greatly, and she would spend years feuding with her. Eventually, Mary was actually ousted by the Scottish nobility, and she fled to England for protection. Elizabeth would not have it, though, and she imprisoned Mary for 18.5 years, until finally she had her executed for plotting to assassinate her. Elizabeth would attempt to avoid conflict throughout her reign, though she did send forces to assist Dutch Protestants against their Catholic Spanish rulers, while Spain accordingly supported the Catholic Irish against the English. Meddling like this would lead to the Anglo-Spanish War in 1585. The situation was exacerbated in 1587 when Mary, the Queen of Scots, was executed. This outraged King Philip of Spain. Mary had left in her will that Philip would inherit her claim to the English throne should she be killed, and Philip vowed to put a Catholic monarch on the English throne, and in fact received support from the Pope to overthrow her. He began preparing a fleet, however it was sabotaged by Sir Francis Drake. A year later the Spanish would repair and set sail for England, but English tactics, as well as unfavorable weather, successfully repelled the Spanish Armada while under the command of Charles Howard and again Francis Drake. While addressing her forces in preparation for a potential Spanish invasion on the island, Elizabeth is quoted as saying, "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And I think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." Elizabeth had defended the Protestant religion in England, and she had defended it from foreign rule as well. She led England during a time in which great figures such as Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and Francis Drake were alive. And by successfully challenging Spanish power, she paved the way for England to become a greater power, thereby opening a road to the Americas. She died in 1603 as the last Tudor monarch. She would be succeeded by King James I, who was also King of Scotland, being the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Despite being the son of an ardent Catholic, James had converted to Protestantism and was intent on keeping England that way. We'll pick up on what happens with James in the next video. For more videos like this and videos on many other subjects, be sure to check out Fire of Learning and subscribe. Thank you for watching.